Kamala Harris and the DNC go heavy on guns in stark contrast to Trump and the RNC. That and more on this week's news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of our news update. My name is Stephen Gutowski. I'm the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America, you can, of course, also buy a membership if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and reporting you will not find anywhere else. Jake is off this week, so it's just me and you guys, and I'm going to try and keep it relatively short here. I want to focus primarily on the DNC, which just closed out shop in Chicago, Illinois on Thursday night, with Kamala Harris taking the nomination for president from the Democratic Party. She gave her acceptance speech. The speech itself was rather light on gun policy. She did mention it as part of the freedom theme that they had going at the DNC this week, and the freedom from gun violence is what she mentioned. Didn't get into policy specifics in the actual speech itself. However, earlier in that night, in primetime, the DNC had a whole block dedicated to the freedom from gun violence, in which you had a series of gun control advocates speak on the issue, which included Gabby Giffords, who is obviously the former congresswoman who survived an assassination attempt at a shooting years ago, and has since gone on to found one of the most significant gun control organizations in the country, which is named after her, Giffords. And they actually outraised the NRA again this month in their political action committee, which is what they primarily focus on. We'll have likely more details on that next week in our reporting. There's been a lot to cover at the DNC, but in that segment at the DNC in primetime, they also featured a video of Kamala Harris it appeared from one of her speeches, where she has echoed this call in basically every speech she's done since President Joe Biden dropped out and endorsed her for president. But the speech included a series of policy promises for enacting red flag laws, universal background checks, and, of course, an assault weapons ban. So that did make it into the DNC's programming. And, in fact, guns were a pretty consistent theme throughout all of the Democratic National Conference. I mean, basically every keynote speaker had at least a section on guns in their speech, from President Joe Biden himself in his speech on Monday, to former President Bill Clinton in his speech touting the current vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, who also in his speech talked at length about his gun ownership and his hunting, and then also his commitment to new gun restrictions, including those three policies mentioned by Harris. So the conference itself was, pretty gun heavy. I would say more so in comparison to the RNC, right? For instance, the platform, which was released on Monday, actually spent more time talking about gun policy than the Democrats' 2020 platform. They dedicated a lot more words to it. Now, a bunch of that was dedicated to President Biden's accomplishments, or I guess the accomplishments of the Biden administration, which of course includes Vice President Kamala Harris, who was even appointed to run the gun prevention task force that they have at the White House now. But the platform doubled down on its commitment to instituting new gun control policies in a way that the obviously Republican platform did not. The Republican platform removed all of its gun policy promises this time around. And there was one embarrassing bit, I would say, from the Democratic platform, which is that this was written, I guess, back in early July when President Biden was still running. And for some reason, for whatever reason, the Democrats have not fully updated it. So there are a lot of references to Joe Biden being their nominee in the official platform that they put out at the DNC, despite, it being, I think, almost a month. I think it's been about 3 weeks since they dumped him, or he, decided not to run for election and then endorsed Kamala Harris. So they didn't update that stuff, including in the gun section. There's a part that talks about women deserving to have a president who has himself been dedicated to gun control. So pretty weird. But the overall point here is the DNC and Kamala Harris herself have been much more vocal on the issue of guns than the RNC and Donald Trump were. Donald Trump, for instance, didn't speak at all about guns, despite giving an 1.5 hour long acceptance speech. He didn't mention the issue once. Kamala Harris did. Really, the RNC could have done what the DNC did and have a whole segment dedicated to the gun issue. They could have brought up, the DNC featured a number of survivors of gun violence. They had quite a lot of gun control activists, top leaders in that movement. The RNC could have easily done the same thing, and has, even Trump himself has done this at times in the past, especially at, for instance, NRA annual meetings. He's had people who, for instance, stopped mass shootings, like Stephen Wolford has spoken as part of Trump's events in the past. So, and then, of course, in 2016, the NRA's top lobbyist at the time, Chris Cox, spoke at the RNC convention. He had a speaking slot. None of that was repeated in 2024 at this RNC. The closest you really got was Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance's anecdote about his grandmother and when she passed away, finding 19 loaded guns throughout her house, and his argument that was a way of showing that she cared for those around her, that she was willing to, defend them. She wanted to have the ability to do that at any point. So that was pretty much all you got in terms of gun policy, not even really policy, obviously, but just gun rights talk at the RNC. And so, I have a whole analysis piece on this that goes through in more detail. But to me, watching both of these events, it's not, I wouldn't say that the DNC was a lot more committed to gun control than it had been in the past, or that the Democratic Party. The shift really for the Democrats began back in 2012, or especially 2018. And even before those shifts to, this point where you don't have much dissent anymore on the issue of guns within the Democratic Party, the 3 issues mentioned by Harris as her top policies, they're pretty much universally embraced in the side of the Democratic Party, except for maybe a couple of red state senators who haven't quite gotten to the point of supporting an assault weapons ban. But outside of that one policy, pretty much everyone is on board with the same set of policies. And to be fair, that's been largely the case in the Republican Party as well. There's not a lot of Republican elected officials at the national level, at the very least, who support an assault weapons ban, for instance. It's really, I think, literally just one left, Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania. So neither party has a lot of diversity left on gun policy at this point. But, the Democrats, I wouldn't say they necessarily dedicated a whole lot more emphasis to guns, but it's been a consistent part of their messaging, and it was a consistent part of the DNC. It wasn't necessarily the main thrust. Kamala Harris, in her acceptance speech, didn't make it the top priority by any stretch of the imagination compared to all the other issues they want to run on. and the way that they framed their opposition to Donald Trump. But it was something that stands out in stark contrast to how the RNC has handled things and how the Trump campaign has done it. That's really where you're seeing this stark difference. It's not really coming from a huge change in the Democratic focus on guns. I don't think. I mean, realistically, especially policy-wise, Kamala Harris had her campaign walked back some of her earlier, further left positions on guns, really specifically on wanting a mandatory buyback of so-called assault weapons, AR-15s and similar firearms that they still want to ban the sale of those firearms. But she had previously, on multiple occasions, expressed support for a mandatory buyback, a gun confiscation, essentially, of those firearms once they were banned. And so her campaign has come out and said she's no longer interested in pushing for that and wouldn't push for it as president. She hasn't said it, of course, herself. She hasn't really talked about gun policy or many other policies in great detail to this point. It's been a common critique of her, I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast has heard to this point. But she has primarily just stuck with what the messaging was from the Biden campaign before he decided to drop out of the race. She's really brought herself more in line with what he was already pursuing. She, despite her record being further to the left than Biden's on guns as an actual politician, either as Attorney General of California or Senator from California, she has primarily just stuck with Biden's messaging, which, to be fair, was already, pretty far to the left from where Democrats had been in the previous administration that Biden served in. Right, the Obama administration did not focus on an assault weapons ban as its primary gun policy, whereas Biden has, and Harris has kept that focus, but hasn't continued on with her efforts to push it even, further to the left than that. So, really, and look, this is more about, I think, the politics of the issue than the policy side. Donald Trump has not necessarily changed any of his policy positions to this point. His campaign has really just kind of minimized the issue, not talked about it much when, they're having high profile moments, big moments, stuff that's likely to get a lot of coverage, like the acceptance speech. There isn't discussion of gun policy. However, he has continued to, when prompted, he had a press conference where he was asked about gun policy and he attacked Harris and, claimed that he would protect the Second Amendment and guns. And he also spoke to the Gun Owners of America conference that they just had recently, with comments along the same lines. So I think the strategy appears to be, don't really talk about this issue very much in high profile instances, but when speaking directly to gun rights activists, they're going to stick with the same message. That seems to be where it's at. Although I will say one of the other pieces of news we have this week is Trump was on Fox and Friends on Thursday, and he did re-up his call for stop and frisk, this time extending it to say, that police should stop and frisk people and take their guns, which is not a new position necessarily, but it's not something he's talked about a whole lot the last couple of years. And of course, with the recent rise of constitutional carry, permitless carry, it's something that is likely to, and kind of already has, caused some consternation among gun rights activists. Stop and frisk is obviously a fairly controversial policy that at times has been found unconstitutional as it's been applied, especially in New York. But it's also one that has some level of support, probably even within, especially the Republican Party, as a sort of law and order type of policy. The idea and Trump says this more or less in his comments to Fox and Friends, and in previous comments to police organizations. He went and spoke in Chicago to a police organization 2 years in a row where he talked about the stop and frisk and this basic concept that he thinks police know the local community well enough that they should be allowed to stop and frisk whoever they believe are troublemakers or criminals, and then confiscate their firearms from them. You can see sort of the obvious problem for at least some gun rights activists who don't even believe that carrying a gun without a permit should be a crime to begin with. So, that's something he mentioned. It's not necessarily a change of policy. I would think, honestly, the more interesting comments he's been making of late have to do with the idea that gun owners don't vote. He's explicitly said that a number of times. It's kind of one of the most consistent messages he's had on guns in the last couple of months here. And it started at the NRA annual meeting back in May. And, he's consistently argued that gun owners don't vote and that they need to turn out and vote for him. But it sort of implies that he kind of thinks that this whole issue is a net negative maybe for him. It's interesting. You can look at how either party has acted around these conventions, especially, and their actions imply that Democrats don't think this is a liability for them, at least not in the ways that they've tried to frame it. For instance, Tim Walz, they've tried to do something similar to what Biden, the way that he had presented himself on guns, which is this idea of, the gun owner and hunter, really not a new concept, but something a lot of politicians have used over the years. A gun owner, hunter who just wants common sense restrictions. That's what they went with. And they when they were introducing Walz and in his speech itself, they leaned heavily into that identity as a veteran and a gun owner and a hunter as sort of credibility for what he wants to do on gun policy. Democrats have taken not a new approach, but one that they're clearly comfortable with and think it's going to be advantageous, at least for them at this point. And, the silence from the Republican Party and some of these comments that Trump has made in recent weeks and months indicates that they don't feel the same way necessarily about guns. Maybe they're concerned about, suburban women. This is a common demographic, the swing demographic, one that Trump has not done well with in the past, where you tend to find more support for gun restrictions and for abortion. And you can sort of see a parallel in how Trump has handled the abortion issue. Just today, he was talking about how he would be good for reproductive rights. He posted that on his social media site, Truth Social. So he hasn't gone quite that far, I would say, in moderating on guns. He's just kind of been a bit quiet about it. Although I did write a piece for the Dispatch back a couple months ago, warning that this could absolutely happen with to gun rights activists too. What's happened to the pro-life activists, and how Trump has shied away from what they want. Hasn't gone to that point yet, I would say, outside of maybe the stop and frisk stuff. But there's definitely a possibility if he views himself as falling behind in this race, and the polling obviously has reversed itself since Harris took over the top of the ticket, and he seems to be responding to that pressure. And you could see more. Usually Trump telegraphs these things. Honestly, like it wasn't a big surprise when Trump started to moderate on abortion, because he telegraphed that for months and months ahead of time. I don't know that he's done quite the same thing with guns yet. So I don't know if if he's going to make a actual policy change or not. But it seems like their strategy has been to minimize the issue outside of events that are specifically for gun rights activists. But, obviously we're going to keep following that here at the Reload as these things unfold down and we get closer to this election, which is just over 2 months away now. I will say, certainly people, if you recall what the conventional wisdom was right up until about halfway through Donald Trump's acceptance speech, everybody in media, in political world seemed to think that Republicans had it and they were going to cruise to victory and Trump was going to win, maybe even in a big pseudo landslide. You can't really, I think most people agree you're not going to get to a real landslide in this political atmosphere anymore. You're not going to get a Reagan or Nixon type landslide victory in the United States in 2024. But, people thought he was going to expand the map. And then that conventional wisdom, I think, has shifted real hard now. And it probably will shift real hard into an overreaction over the next week or so when we start seeing what people should expect from a political convention, which is a bump for the party that just hosted their convention. It's a common thing to happen in politics and political polling. It's a known phenomenon. And I would expect, I don't know if the bump will be big, maybe Harris is already sort of riding her convention bump because of the change in candidates, which is an unusual thing, obviously. But I would still expect to see some sort of surge and get a lot of overreactions to where things are today. So for the next week or two, just watch out for that. I think people start to assume that they know exactly how the election is going to turn out way before the election actually happens. And the safer bet, looking at the last 3 election cycles, is it's probably going to be a close one. And it's probably best to not get over enthusiastic in one direction or another, regardless of which candidate you want to see win. And just remember that politics moves very quick now and things can turn around. Nobody, like I said, halfway through Trump's speech, before he went off prompter, I think everyone thought he had it wrapped up. A lot of people did. And now you're going to have a lot of people who think Harris has it wrapped up. And I think the political reality of the country is it's just never going to be quite that simple. So we will, of course, continue to follow all of those things as the election draws closer, and hopefully we'll have Jake back next week, and we'll be a little bit more of a back and forth. But of course, the DNC is not the only thing that happened this week. We actually also got a poll from CBS News and YouGov that kind of, I think, adds credence to this, to my confusion on the Republican approach to gun policy at this point, because this poll found that 58% of voters, likely voters, in fact, viewed gun policy or guns as having a major impact on their vote. And there was 88% overall said it had some impact, at least a minor impact on their vote going into this election. So it's still something that Americans tend to value quite a bit in who they end up deciding to vote for. And this poll, I think, underscores that. It may not be the top issue. I think was somewhere in the middle of the pack, which is where guns end up being. Oftentimes, it tends to be something of a second tier issue at times when there haven't been a lot of mass shootings, which, by the way, they still haven't had like a major mass shooting in the United States this year. It's kind of remarkable. And the crime rate, as Jeff Asher notes in a piece that we linked to this week, is still falling. The murder rate is dropping at an unprecedented rate at this point. Now, obviously, that's possible because it rose at such a quick rate during the pandemic years, 2020, 2021. So it's not, it's sort of the rate of decline masks the fact that things aren't it doesn't mean that things are going fantastically. It's just that we're coming off of a very bad time. And that's still good news, of course. But hopefully we'll settle out even lower than we were before the pandemic. That would be ideal. And we'll have to see, and probably have to have Jeff back on the show at some point down the line here, maybe when we get a little further into the year and we have a little more finality to some of this data and trend. But good news so far, certainly on that front, and perhaps having some impact on where people rate gun policy in their impact, in the impact that it has on their vote, because guns tend to, of course, get a lot more political salience around mass shootings and crime waves, and we aren't experiencing either of those at the moment. So, in a sense, that actually makes it somewhat more impressive that gun policy is still stuck around as at least mid-tier issue in the election. The economy, inflation, things like that rate higher, but you still have guns as a pretty significant part of how people feel about whether they should cast their vote for Trump or Kamala. And, this poll indicates, this is another interesting thing about this whole RNC silence on guns and the Trump approach right now. It's not really clear from any of this polling that Democrats have a huge advantage on guns. Now, this poll, I will say, the CBS News YouGov poll does show that Democrats and liberals tend to say gun policy is more important to their vote, is a bigger factor than Republicans and conservatives, which is a bit unusual, right? Because one of the long-running assumptions that many people in the political world have on gun policy is that it motivates gun owners who tend to be more conservative a lot more than it does, liberal voters who don't own guns and favor more restrictions. So this poll maybe gives credence perhaps to what Democrats are doing by not shying away from the issue. But at the same time, there was also a recent Fox News poll that asked just who people trust more to handle guns and gun policy. And in that poll, Donald Trump led Kamala Harris by 3 points. It's not a huge majority. It's not a huge lead, but Trump was at 50% and Kamala was at 47%. So, at best, in the recent polling and this, polling on guns has not been a top priority for pollsters this election cycle. You can tell if you go through a lot of these polls that have come out in recent weeks and months. There's just not a lot of discussion of guns, and often one of the things that can complicate analyzing this stuff is the fact that pollsters tend to poll guns differently, right? Like the CBS News YouGov poll asks about gun policy, whereas the Fox poll asks about guns. And then we also have a couple of other recent polls from, the Washington Post or Ipsos, and they ask about crime and gun violence or just gun violence. So you're kind of asking slightly different questions to people. And so it does complicate how much we can take away from each poll. These aren't the end all be all. We're just really looking at crumbs and polling. Of course, it's polls are more of a snapshot in time, right? They're sort of a fuzzy snapshot of where people are at. They're not a perfect predictor of how things are going to go. They just give you some insight. Polling is not perfect. What I would take away from what we have available to us is just that it's a pretty polarized issue, like a lot of issues are. And there doesn't seem to be a good reason for one party to emphasize guns while the other party doesn't or stay silent. That's what I see in these numbers. It just doesn't add up to me. But, of course, the campaigns themselves have their own pollsters and do their own, I'm sure, issue polling on specific demographics that they're trying to target. Like I said earlier, it's probably suburban women who have traditionally been a harder get for Donald Trump, even though in the past they have been a better block for the Republican Party. So, maybe that's the play, right? That's seems like what they're going for with this strategy of moderating on abortion and de-emphasizing gun politics. But I don't know. And, obviously Donald Trump is not a man who necessarily always follows a script. So, not everything he says and does can be interpreted as giving you a perfect picture of the strategy at play, if that makes any sense. But so we had that poll that I think casts some doubt on the Republican efforts right now, the gun politics that they're putting forward. But we, of course, also had some news coming out of the courts this week. We actually had a bunch of news, couldn't get to every single one of it. We are a small publication, do our best. But, this week I was with Jake on vacation. I wrote basically all these stories, although this one is from Jake. We published just before he left. So, California, there's been actually a couple of rulings out of California, but the one I'm going to cover right now is the appeals court blocking a law that limited the number of guns people could buy within a 30-day period. It's a sort of one gun a month rule. California is not the only state that has it. In fact, Virginia, where I live, has the same rule as applied to handguns, at least. And this came under renewed legal scrutiny with a challenge being successful in Nguyen v. Bonta, where, they actually, so this is a little bit in the weeds here, right? There was a ruling in this case recently where the district judge found the restriction was unconstitutional. It didn't comply with the Second Amendment. There was no historical tradition for this sort of restriction, or at least the government hadn't proven one, met the burden that they need to under Bruin. And so they blocked the law. Then the motion for so the state is appealing this decision. They've asked for a stay from the appeals court, which in the Ninth Circuit, where California is, happens a lot of the time, right? Yeah, I mean, and also just happens often in all federal litigation. You'll get stays pending appeal. The courts like to preserve the status quo outside of, significant circumstances that they determine require, the status quo to be upset. And so, the courts try to keep things the same as these cases proceed through. But in this particular case, the 3-judge panel that is going to hear this appeal actually denied the motion for a stay pending appeal. So the appeal is likely to still go forward, but in that time, the law won't be enforced. So Californians can now go ahead and it seems for the moment, buy as many guns as they want in a 30-day period. There is no longer that limit on how many firearms can be bought at once. Obviously significant news out of California. I think they also had a ruling this week that is going to force them to issue non-resident permits, among a couple of other, along with removing a couple of other restrictions on gun carry in the state. So California has not fared well this week in court, whereas the gun rights activists who've been challenging their laws have fared pretty well. So that's significant news there. Of course, we also have a policy change from YouTube that is taking a real chunk out of a lot of professional gun tubers' paychecks, it seems like, or their potential for earning a living through the platform. YouTube spoke with me I did an interview with a couple of spokesmen or spokespeople from the company, and we published that piece this week talking about mainly the issue with it's actually not so much a change in the written policy as it is a change in the unwritten enforcement of a policy they had previously had about linking to sites that sell gun or ammunition, and the fact that they're sort of changing how they enforce that to reemphasize spoken links or directing people to these sites, but through the video itself, which could be a problem for a lot of major YouTubers. If you ever watched any gun tubers, they often have sponsorships from ammo dealers or gun dealers. And the ammo dealer one seems to be a new unwritten policy because it's not in their firearms policy. The firearms policy talks about people their websites that sell ammunition magazines that hold more than 30 rounds, which is how YouTube defines a high capacity magazine, which is different from basically everyone else that defines it. But hasn't talked about ammo dealers, but they did confirm to me that that is part of this rule. So we actually are going to have John Patton, who runs the Gun Collective, which is a YouTube channel that focuses on gun news, on the interview podcast this week. So make sure that you're subscribed to the show and check that one out when it comes out on Monday. Of course, if you want to get it a day early, you should buy a membership over at thereload.com. You'll get access on Sunday alongside your extra email that you get, your members newsletter, and you'll be able to hear the show first. And I would highly recommend picking up a membership because that is how we stay afloat. This is how we do business. Our work is funded by you guys, by the readers, not by anyone else. We are an independent publication that is fully funded by its members. So, it's subscribers. And look, membership gets you a lot of extra perks. You get a bunch of extra content that is exclusive to members, mostly our analysis, our in-depth analysis, but you also, of course, get the podcast a day early and an opportunity to appear on the show if you want to. Just reply to your members' newsletter and let me know that you'd like to be on the show. We just had a member segment on the last episode. If you want to go check that one out, with Alex Bosco, who's the inventor of the pistol brace. He was on the show, and he's going to be he's the one that we interviewed, and he gives us some insight into their recent win over the ATF in court. So check that episode out and then come back and check out our next interview episode on those YouTube changes. That's all we've got for you guys this week. Talk to you again real soon.